Welcome to Medcan Presents, the webinar series that Medcan stages every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. Today's webinar is the second wave of COVID-19 with Andrew Zimakas and Dr. Peter Nord. Andrew Zimakas is Chief Product and Revenue Officer at Medcan. Dr. Peter Nord is Chief Medical Officer. We're expecting a lot of return people from our previous webinar, so we're not going to go through the actual our actual bios. Okay, so people are answering. Let's just wait another 10 seconds or so. So Dr. Nord and Andrew, you can come in and activate your cameras and activate your audio. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay. Do you expect that a second wave of COVID-19 this fall will be serious enough to prompt a return to lockdown in your region? So 3% are certain that we will need to enact lockdown measures. 50%, the winner here is, I think it highly likely. 32% are pretty sure, 16% say I don't think so, and 0% say no way we've solved COVID-19 in Canada. Well, that's pretty interesting. I think that I'm with the majority there. Andrew and Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the majority rules in this case. That's sort of what we're feeling. I think if you ask friends and neighbors and certainly business leaders, that's sort of what we're expecting, and maybe just, prudent to plan it at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I should mention before we launch into the actual presentation that please do ask questions. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and the way that you do that by now people should know, but you press the Q&A button at the top of your screen. You can also ask questions by the chat function. Okay, Andrew, do you want to provide some context for us?
I'd love to. Thanks everyone for joining. That poll was a good setup to a little bit of context around should we expect a second wave in the fall, and I think most people are expecting it, as we just saw. So let's talk about the importance, and I think the importance to employers is insofar that it triggers a return of lockdown measures, whether that's full lockdown measures or partial. Very important from the perspective of employers, employees, and other workplace stakeholders. If lockdown measures happen, our perspective is, Dr. Nord will be speaking to, is that it's likely to be more regional than what we've experienced, and therefore we need to respond to this in a flexible way. And one important question for many employers is whether to return to strict lockdown measures, let's say in particular in an urban area like Toronto, in the event that there is a second wave of some kind. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more, but that's a little bit more context connecting this to the workplace. So we're going to go a little deeper here and talk about metrics to watch. So I'm going to set this up, and again, Dr. Nord is going to dive into this a little bit deeper. But the important point, and many people know this based upon recent media coverage, is that the important number is not necessarily the overall case number. It can be a useful indicator in some respects, but really what policymakers are going to be watching for, especially as spikes in hospitalizations, whether that's a reason to initiate a return to lockdown measures. The other piece, of course, that has been topical lately is the age makeup of people infected, with outbreaks among younger people less likely to trigger hospitalizations. Obviously still potentially concerning as it relates to spread, and the rate of increase recently among younger people has been quite high in some regions as well, particularly in the United States. And then finally, the positivity rate also forms an important metric when you talk about community spread. And for perspective, experts want to see this number below 5%. It's around 1% in Canada, and at the other end of the spectrum, again, in the news a lot lately, is Florida, which is about 20%. So those are some of the metrics. There's several more, but those are some of the key ones to watch as it relates to a lockdown. So is a second wave likely to trigger lockdowns is really the key question. And when we talk about future waves and lockdowns, like I mentioned earlier, the likelihood of regional outbreaks is high, just given sort of the clusters and the outbreaks that we've seen to date, both in Canada and in other countries. Needless to say, in densely populated urban areas like those in Toronto, the probability goes up. School openings, very topical right now, given we're approaching early August, and easing of social distancing measures, which we're experiencing right now in different provinces, including Ontario, increases the potential for issues as we head into the fall. And finally, we believe the likelihood of future waves triggering at least regional lockdowns is high enough that it makes sense for us to plan with our clients and employers that we're connected with to prepare for a plan to deal with that possibility. So it's really all about preparing for the possibility, whether it's regional outbreaks, whether it's broader. So various scenarios make sense to plan for. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nord to start discussing best practices in that regard.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so the next few slides really are pretty high level overview and basically the big buckets that we would recommend for corporations to be thinking about. Small businesses, medium-sized, large businesses, it really applies fairly broadly. And so we can jump right into the first slide in the next section. And really, that's around reviewing what every business has already done. So, you know, this was new for everybody. Many organizations had already established a pandemic plan. Back at SARS, H1N1, you know, businesses have had to deal with these sort of things in the past. For some organizations, it was sort of dusting off the pandemic plan and instituting. But for the most part, most organizations have never had to deal with anything like this. So we were all learning very, very quickly from each other, from the research that was going on globally, developing policies on the fly. And so now is a time to look back and kind of say, well, what worked well? What didn't work so well? If we had to do it all over again, what would we do different? And what can we do going forward? So right now we're kind of in a nice opportunity, kind of a lull, you know, the pause before a potential next storm to kind of look back, what worked, what didn't work, where were the pinch points, where were the challenges that we had, where did we get some feedback that we didn't do as good job, let's say on communication, the way we packaged information wasn't entirely appropriate for our stakeholders and audiences. So what were those learnings that we could think about? And then, as we've mentioned on a previous webinar, use this time to think strategically about what your business is going to look like, not in the fall, but what's it going to look like 18 months from now or 24 months from now, and then back into a response that's more of a short-term response, but with one eye always on that horizon. And what's that North Star going to be for your organization as we go forward? So that's sort of take a pause, really look at your COVID-19 response, see if there's any tweaks, because ultimately if we go into a lockdown, we're going to take a step back from a phase 3 back to a phase 2 or a phase 2 to a phase 1. So we want to be able to get that right and learn from what our previous phases were like. Next slide. Moving ahead, contact tracing apps. So we're a little mystified because we heard a flurry of activity a few weeks ago about the federal government and several provincial governments getting involved with distributing contact tracing apps. Honestly, we haven't heard that much since then, and there are apps that are being developed either as a standalone versus federal government. At the end of the day, they're probably all good, and we would recommend that we learn from what are the sort of best in practice apps. At the end of the day, the main thing is privacy maintained at all times, anonymity, and then functionality and the benefit that comes from these contact tracing apps. Probably the best example is South Korea, where they instituted a countrywide contact tracing app worked off Bluetooth, highly effective in terms of developing a policy, social policy measures to keep the spread at a minimum. Screening tools. Next slide. Same sort of thing. A little easier to implement and to adopt. So screening tools are critically important for our staff before they come onto an on-site workspace versus a home workspace. It's important to deploy these screening tools, and there's lots out there. We have one, but lots of folks have them, and we really want to sort of double down in terms of getting those screening tools. They do help. Plus, they also show to the employee population that we're on it, and it's also potentially a communication tool. You can attach communications and updates to those screening tools that you could deploy across your employee population. So that's screening tools. Next, antibody, and the slide isn't exactly right because all of the antibody testing, and there's more to follow in a couple of weeks on this, but Medcan, we've sort of become leaders in this area. We've been down a couple of cul-de-sacs on this one, but now we're excited about being able to move into the antibody testing space. The image here is of a nasal swab. All of the antibody testing that will be happening initially in Canada is actually a blood sample. So we just didn't want to show a needle going into someone's arm because it's lunchtime right now. But but that's what we mean by serology testing, means blood serum. And these tests, you have to take them with a grain of salt. They tell you some things about a person's individual immunity on a given day. What it doesn't say is how long is the immunity good for, and how strong is the immunity. And anybody who gets their antibody testing through Medcan, we actually have a 2-page information and informed consent form. So prior to having your test, we want you to understand exactly what you're getting and what you're not getting. And that's going to be critically important going forward. So very exciting to be able to do this work, and lots of question marks still around antibody testing. We're actually starting a research study in the next couple of weeks for individuals that may choose to opt in through Medcan. And what we're going to be looking at is actually the strength and duration of the immunity that's associated with having an exposure to COVID-19. And this work really hasn't been done before in the kind of way we're going to be approaching it. So the study will run for a year, and we'll be at the end of that year I think we'll be able to publish some very good, solid scientific research on for our population. How long did the immunity kind of last for? How strong was the immunity? That sort of thing. So stay tuned. Lots of exciting things happening on the antibody testing, but don't be fooled. It won't be a nasal swab. So on to the next one. Employee bubbles. It doesn't require a lot of explanation. I think most of the individuals and corporations that we work with understand what it means by having a bubble. It just means a group that share a common degree of exposure to COVID and hopefully lack of that. And so, when it comes down to the physical location, it really means think about minimizing movement, think about minimizing contact between people, closing those common areas that are contact points that could potentially be a real sharing of COVID if there's any COVID virus that's brought into the area. So just like we talked about community bubbles, think about employee bubbles, segment your areas, egress points, elevators, high touch points, cleaning, protective equipment, PPE, all of that to wrap a protective bubble essentially around smaller groups of employees. That's just good risk management these days. And of course, along with that means investing in PPE. After SARS went through, people were stockpiling lots of PPE, and then eventually it just started gathering dust and it started being utilized, and then the stockpiles wore down to nothing. And so at this point, we were recommending that this won't be the last virus that affects humankind. And it's not so matter, not to be too depressing, but it's just a matter of time before the next coronavirus makes its way into our ethos globally. And so really have to double down in terms of budgeting for PPE, budgeting for plexiglass, budgeting for what it takes to be physically distancing for safety, both for employees and for customers as well. And then, of course, mental health. One of the things that we're going to be finding over the next months and years, actually, is the effect that this has taken on our collective mental health. And that's going to range the gamut from people that were already really kind of struggling, and this has really just added a real burden to them, to people that were, essentially had no mental health issues, and this has really become a challenge. Not only now, but especially, our cold, dark months in Canada can, on a good year, will create some worsening mood, whether that's just a worsening mood or frank depression. Where does that all end up? And the burden on our society, the burden on our organizations corporately, from a productivity perspective, massive. So we really want to identify in a very open, proactive, and inclusive way, identifying and offering supports for people as they will experience mental health challenges. And that's going to be a very large percentage, whether we overtly experience that with our employee populations, or more covertly underneath the radar, and that may come out in different ways. It may come out in a performance evaluation that wasn't as good as last year. And it's the mental health challenges, not a volitional performance issue. So really can't say enough about this one, and we're going to be finding out over the next, again, months and years exactly how much of a toll this is going to be taking on our population as a whole, and for sure our employee population. So with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Thanks, Dr. Nord. I see we've got some good questions coming through, so I want to make sure we leave a few minutes for those. I've answered one of them, but there's a few more. So I'll cover the last couple of items here fairly quickly. The first around keeping customers and staff engaged, obviously critical, obviously ties into the mental health element that Peter just covered. But there's just a few comments I'll make on this. Keeping staff and also your broader stakeholder group informed on what measures you've implemented to ensure their safety while you're navigating the pandemic is really important. If there is a second lockdown, instilling trust and confidence in those stakeholders is going to be key. So re-looking that plan, which you no doubt have in place currently, and that again to anticipate a second wave is very important. The other item I'll mention on this is the whole idea of using virtual events and social events as well, a mental health item, to try to keep teams connected at a smaller team level rather than large town halls, say 10, 20 people, can be really important. You can sprinkle in some light education to that as well, but the connectivity piece is critical. And then the last item I'll mention is fairly broad. If you can go to the next slide, Chris. You know, the adage around opportunity in crisis obviously applies to the situation we're in right now, and looking at the business model as a whole for a company and how to maintain revenue specifically, which you know, has been impaired for a number of companies, is very important. And really just looking for what are our core competencies? What are our capabilities? How can we use this as maybe a bit of an R&D test pilot phase? And one example at Medcan, we were impacted significantly through the first wave of COVID. We kept the clinic operating for some of our services, but for many of them, we had to shut those down in person. That led us to accelerate a number of virtual capabilities across many parts of our business. And to do that from a virtual care standpoint is one, to extend that into fitness, to extend that into sports therapy is another. And so it really challenged us to think differently, and we're going to take that forward and apply that to those businesses going forward, which I think is a really, really good thing. So I'll just close it off there, Chris, just to make sure, again, we have time for some questions.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Dr. Peter Nord. So let's go through the questions. We'll start with the first one. What are your perspectives on, what are your perspectives on balancing the isolation some feel from the remote working environment, in particular mental health concerns, versus keeping people working remotely? I think that speaks to the kind of the camaraderie that happens from working in a shared workspace. Who wants to take that one?
Well, maybe I can just start, and then Andrew can certainly jump in. Again, it's tough to answer the question because it's a bit of a bell curve, right? You have some people that love being by themselves in their home, and they can be more productive, and they're saving commuting time, or they're saving the cost of commuting and parking, and love it. They're thriving. And then, there's probably the middle of that bell curve, which is the average, which is, it's okay. It works. A little frustrating when I lose my signal, or the kids are getting in the way, or, trying to balance work-life balance. And then you have the other people which find it just horrific. And one of the main reasons that they've chosen to work with a particular organization is because of the social networking and the rewards they get from doing that. And we've had several of our very large corporate clients where many of their corporate workers are really missing that almost family feel of being around the office. And so really important that we have to try and deal with all of that and be open to the breadth of an individual by individual, and make sure that our policies can deal with all of that. I think if we're dealing with the median, it would behoove everybody to think about a hybrid solution where people are coming on site, whatever that looks like, if they can, just to bond with team members and to bring people on site in team-based, essentially your bubble, like the team bubble comes on site for whether that's a day a week or 3 days a week or 1 day every 2 weeks. But that's proving to be quite successful, and we're doing that at Medcan.
The only thing that I would add, Chris, and I think that's well covered, is and it ties into Peter's last point, which is if there is a go forward plan, to the extent possible, I think communicating that to employees when a company is able to is really, really important. Otherwise, the current state seems endless. And for some people, that's not a problem. For other people, it can be quite devastating. And so I think being able to time box things, again, depending on what happens in terms of progression of the current situation, is really important in terms of mental health and setting expectations.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Dr. Nord. We have two questions that involve Medcan's antibody testing. So one in chat and then one in the actual questions. We'll handle them together. So the first question, has Medcan officially begun COVID antibody testing, or is it still ramping up? And the second one, when it is happening, will COVID testing be done for those coming in for our annual visits?
So maybe I can lead off on that, Peter, and you can elaborate. We are still ramping up on antibody testing. We're putting in place all the sort of necessary measures in order to do that. So it is still forthcoming. We can't put a specific date on it. I think the last we communicated is we're still expectant that we'll be able to offer it at some point in August. And then the second question, yes, we are going to be offering antibody testing as part of our annual health assessment health assessments in clinics. So Peter, not sure if you want to add anything to either of those.
No, that's perfect. We're initially, we have to make sure that our quality assurance is in place. So we're in the middle of really doing that. We're working with the Mayo Clinic in the States. So we have some very, very sophisticated and best in the world partners that have been with us and we're kind of in lockstep with what they're doing in the US, because the antibody tests have been in the US now for some time. So we're taking advantage of some of the runway that they've laid down for us.
Fantastic. One quick question. Can you show the results of the survey at the end of the call again? I will run, so we post these webinars on YouTube and we send an email out so that people, and anybody who's registered has a link to the YouTube video of the webinar. And I'll put the results of the poll in that so that everybody has access to that. We're running to the end of our time. Let's go through two more quick questions. So we talked about potential for future outbreaks, and we talked about dense urban centers. But gentlemen, are there potential for other outbreaks in other areas, perhaps of the economy or other regions that you think have a high potential for happening?
Yeah, I'll jump in. The potential is there, as we've seen even over the last number of weeks, where the trend was going down and suddenly we had some little blips where the number of positive cases was increasing. And it tended to be, at first headline was, Ontario sees doubling of daily count, when in fact, you read behind that and it was Ottawa, Halton, Essex County. Each of those were for very specific reasons. A bar started opening up, or there was a couple of parties and 20 or 30 kids all got together, and that created an actual hotspot, which was on the Ontario landscape. Or in Essex County, again, we've had some foreign migrant workers to help with the agri industry. That can easily create a very small but intense hotspot. But the real concern, as we've said, is a dense urban environment where a small hotspot can actually become really significant, and then potentially get into the long-term care homes, affect the hospitalization rates, which again are the take-home. The reason why we did all of this work is to flatten the curve so that our health system wasn't overrun. We've won that battle completely. And so at this point, we really just need to monitor, as we get into a potential second wave, that hospitalization rate, the ICU rate, the ventilator use rate. Those are the things that are going to be hopefully looked at, not just the positive rate as we go forward. So I think that's the potential could be anything from small to large, urban to rural, although the risks are higher for sure in a more densely populated area.
Fantastic. Final question, future lockdowns, what do they look like? Are we going to see, empty downtowns the way we saw circa April, early May? Or are we going to see a more nuanced take on, where we deploy various levers, but not everything at the same time?
I think it all depends on the severity, the regionality or lack thereof of spread, and will be situation specific. That's the likelihood given the pattern that we've seen to date. But this virus has also shown some unpredictability. So I think you need to be ready for a full lockdown scenario in worst case, and then a more selective, nuanced lockdown in others. I think you need to look at the spectrum of possibilities.
Fantastic. I think that's it for the questions. We'll just run through other resources. So in addition to webinars, we create a lot of content here at Medcan. One of those things is Eat, Move, Think podcast, episode 24, which posted on Monday, is about how COVID-19 really spreads. And that features guest host Dr. Peter Nord talking to a couple of experts, infectious disease experts, who break down the actual probabilities based on best evidence as to how COVID transmits over fomites, which is inanimate objects. We're talking about like elevator buttons or countertops or things like that. We'll also talk about airborne transmission and the potential for that. So simple way to get to that is bit.ly/Medcan_transmission. Okay, thanks very much. Have a wonderful week, people.